University?
I am the Thomas G. Jewell, two L's, Jewell, Professor of Reading.
Great research.
Well, it's an interesting story about how I eventually became an educator. Even though there's no history of a teacher on either side of my family, I was the first, I still think that teaching is in my DNA somehow. I remember as a child at 5th, 6th grade, I would invite friends over and actually teach them science lessons and then give them multiple choice tests. I don't know how I had any friends left after that, but when I entered college, I really still hadn't decided to become a teacher, but I earned degrees in both literature and mathematics, kind of strange bedfellows. But I think that is why this dualism led me not only to an interest in reading, but also to take a quantitative stance on most of the issues that I encountered. Not that I don't value qualitative research, I certainly do, but it's just that I'm more comfortable in the quantitative realm. When I begin to think about the individuals who have influenced my thinking, it's quite a long list. It's really difficult to narrow it down. But if pressed, I think that I could identify 4 in particular, beginning with my advisor, my mentor at the University of Missouri, Dick Robinson, who taught me many things, among them that I was capable of publishing and doing research. And I think more than anything else, he taught me how to be a professor. So I felt well-grounded when I left. And I'm very happy that our relationship has endured across 4 decades. But I owe getting off to a good start to Dick. Then in the early phase of my career at Wichita State, another individual who influenced me greatly, a fellow named Jack Miller, who went on to become a college president, influenced me largely because of his approach to problems. He was extremely analytical, level-headed, and practical above all else. And I observed this happen so many times. I tried to emulate it with varying degrees of success, but I certainly owe that to him, and that's another enduring relationship that resulted most recently in a book on world literacy that I'm proud of. Then when I moved to Georgia, I began my work with Steve Stahl. I was at Georgia Southern University, so I was sort of backdoor relation to the University of Georgia, but I was up there all the time working with Steve. And Steve was a daunting individual. He was so broad and deep that it was just inspiring to be around him, if a little off-putting at times. In Georgia, I also began a relationship in terms of research with Sharon Walpole, my gifted colleague from the University of Delaware. And Sharon's influence on my thinking was that it's one thing to explore approaches to instruction. But it's quite another. It does you no good unless you can also identify ways of getting teachers to implement those approaches. So together we went into the area of professional development, published 3 books on literacy coaching, and she made a believer out of me that that's really what is quite important. So both sides of the coin, identifying effective techniques and making sure that teachers can actually use them. So if I look back across all 4 of those individuals, I would say that a sort of a unifying thread is practicality, pragmatics. And in particular, the need for your career, your activities to actually translate into higher levels of achievement and motivation for kids. If you can do that, you've done quite a bit. And that was true of all 4 of those individuals, and hopefully it's rubbed off on me. Element that would come first to mind in most folks, educators who are familiar with my work, would be my connection with the what's come to be called the Garfield survey of reading attitudes based on the cartoon character Garfield. And this has been used, this published in 1990. It's been used in a number of different research studies, and I'm kind of associated with it very directly through all these years. I think there's an interesting backstory in how this came to be that not very many people know, but it's quite interesting to me, that the first of these pictorial scales that I'm aware of was introduced in the early 60s, 61, I believe, by a teacher in suburban Detroit named Paul Campbell. And he began by crafting 15 statements about reading, or a kid's orientation towards reading. And to respond, all they had to do was point to a picture of Snoopy. And he got these pictures simply by clipping them out of the daily paper until he got the 5 that he wanted, ranging from extremely angry to extremely joyful. In the middle, I remember there was a picture of Snoopy in an indifferent pose, asleep on top of his doghouse. And so this became extremely popular. This was before the internet. It was simply circulated from Xerox to Xerox, teacher to teacher, and made its way down to Arizona State University. And an educational psychologist there named Don Jacobs, who decided, because of its popularity, to investigate its psychometric properties. So he wanted to establish its reliability and validity. But by now, it was the mid-70s, and a famous lawsuit involving intellectual property and copyright involving Kinko's, millions of dollars in settlement, was front page news. And so Don Jacobs heard about this, and he thought, before I begin duplicating this, perhaps I'd better get permission from United Features Syndicate, the Snoopy people. Basically, it was a sort of nondescript, blasé letter. It's okay if I duplicate this. Right? And they wrote back, the lawyers did, and said that under no circumstances did he have permission to do it. And I've talked to lawyers since then, and they say that sounds very uncharitable, and Snoopy and other cartoon characters are warm and fuzzy. But you have to remember that there are properties. And the fear was that if we give teachers permission to duplicate these, that what they'll do is clip them out of the survey and blow them up and make posters out of them. And we sell posters. So they're kind of undercutting that kind of profit. And I guess that makes a certain amount of sense. I still regard it as a little narrow-minded. So we decided since we could not use that scale at all, we decided to begin to craft another one. This was some years later. But before investing a lot of time in it, we decided to go right to the source and get permission from the get-go, if we could. We didn't really expect to get it because of these arguments. But we surveyed a group of elementary students in Wichita, Kansas, and its environs, and asked them their favorite cartoon character. And there was a hands-down winner, was Garfield at that point in time. And so, again, we had nothing to lose. We wrote a letter to Jim Davis, the creator of Garfield, asking him to help us, to become kind of a collaborator. And we wanted 4 pictures of Garfield, ranging from ecstatic to very negative. And so he wrote back. He didn't just write back. He wrote back and sent us the pictures, which had serial numbers, and I think a lot of them just came out of cold storage, and makes me wonder how many pictures he actually draws when he does the daily strip. But these were perfect. So we had the go-ahead, the green light from Jim Davis and his lawyers, and we proceeded then to develop the survey and norm it nationally on a survey of a sample of about 17,000 kids. And so it became very popular, and we published results based on that. But so to go back to the idea of my most significant contribution, yeah, you could certainly name that's probably my best known at this point. But I've come to believe that a more significant contribution may lie in the development of a core reading program called Bookworms. And this was really the brainchild of my colleague Sharon Walpole. And I feel very privileged to have helped her, co-developed it with her all along the way. It is totally free, but that's not its major attraction. it is a major attraction, but more importantly, it is developed on the basis of the available evidence, best practice, if you want to call it that. So we began with the idea of incorporating into the various lesson plans and materials that go along with it, the idea of how is it best approached to ultimately result at the end of grade 5 in a proficient reader with a motivation to read. And we think that we accomplished that goal. If that's the ideal, I think that Bookworms is a program that comes as close to the ideal as possible. We're hopeful, and our data so far suggests that we're definitely on the right track. So long term, I think that is the most significant contribution that I've made, and I'm happy to have made it with such an eminent colleague as Sharon. When I think of important trends that have occurred and are in the process of occurring across time, one of the advantages of being really old is, and there are advantages, is the fact that you can see the long term. You can get a sense of a trajectory across decades. And in fact, you've lived part of that trajectory, so you know it inside and out. Now, when I began as a professor in 1977, this was the very height of the cognitive science movement. This had just replaced behaviorism as a better way of understanding the reading process from a cognitive standpoint. And there were even journals that were changing their names. The Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior became Memory and Cognition. We can't use the word behavior anymore. So the cognitive science movement was certainly in its heyday in the 70s and 80s. But in the late 80s, early 90s, questions began to arise about whether this was a little bit too narrow a perspective. And the chief question that was posed was, what about the social context in which reading occurs? It's not enough to understand what happens in the head during reading. What about the social context and its influences on reading? Not only reading comprehension, but reading growth and development. And I think that this is an extremely good question, very well posed. But to me, the danger lies in going too far in that direction and looking at everything through a sociocultural lens and forgetting the cognitive science that has to be part of your idea about how reading develops, how comprehension occurs. And I think that too many researchers in this area have lost sight of that. You can see it in their writing. They're simply not aware of the other side of the coin, the cognitive side. And I guess I would go one step further and suggest that if you are dyed-in-the-wool sociocultural researcher and take that perspective, that you are really risking, unless you have a reasonable, not necessarily an extremely deep, but a reasonable grasp of cognitive science that lies behind reading, that you risk creating a generation of readers who simply lack the proficiency to engage eventually as full members of our society. And so I say that sounds harsh, but it's heartfelt, and I think I would issue that as a caution to researchers anywhere to not lose sight of the cognitive side of reading. Well, the transition from a cognitive stance to a sociocultural and even a sociocognitive stance created a lot of tension within the world of reading researchers. Tension is probably the mildest word. I mean, it created a vast rift that persists today. And I was sort of caught in the middle of this, somewhat naively. And I think a good starting point, focal point for this tension was the whole language movement, the idea that, and especially its idea that focusing on skill development in any kind of decontextualized way was anathema to serious reading development. And so a couple of colleagues, I've mentioned Dick Robinson and Jack Miller, and I, in 1990 published an article in Educational Researcher suggesting, somewhat naively, a research agenda for whole language that would establish or refute its effectiveness as an approach to reading development instructionally. And this was immediately attacked, and I was really shocked at the vehemence. I can tell you that we sent the article off to Ed Researcher. The article in those days, the editor in those days was David Berliner at Arizona State, and I didn't hear from him for some time. This was probably not unusual, except I just had the audacity to call him up and ask him what was going on. It had been several months. And he said, well, here's the problem. I sent this off to 3 eminent reviewers. 2 of them said, publish it immediately without any change. The other one said, don't publish it under any circumstances. So he said, I don't know what to do. I've just been mulling this over, and I did come up with an idea, and see how you feel about this. We will publish it as is, and we will give this 3rd reviewer a chance to respond, but we will give you the last word, kind of a rejoinder, so A, B, A. And we jumped at the chance, and I thought, well, this is fantastic, until I received the actual piece that the other reviewer, a woman named Carol Edelsky, wrote, and I was just shocked at how vehement the vitriol was in that piece. And it really signifies, I think, the emotional rift between these 2 camps, as Richard Anderson once described, 2 camps in reading. So this was the situation when I moved to Georgia and began working with Steve Stahl. We tried to enact at least a part of the agenda that we had prescribed, and were heartened by the fact that the pendulum was swinging back in the direction of explicit skills development, not without losing sight of vocabulary and comprehension development at the same time. So we were convinced that a balance could be struck, but Steve constantly reminded me, remember, this is a pendulum. It's probably going to go back the other way eventually, despite our best efforts. So that was my involvement in this whole rift between the 2 camps of the sociocultural and the cognitive, which I think stands today. Even though the 2 sides tend to ignore one another, it's still a real line of division. Well, when I think of my own students and the advice that I would give them as they start their careers, that I think I've learned from experience, and as a bad example in particular. I mean, I'm associated with a number of different areas, including technology and comprehension, assessment, attitudes, literacy coaching, and so I'm spread very thin. So there's a age-old axiom in educational research that when you begin your career, you stake out a narrow domain and operate within that domain. Establish yourself and make some contributions there, because that's the area you're going to know the most about. You're going to have a deep knowledge of it. And to me, that makes perfect sense in the beginning of your career. But my advice is to start there, but not stay there. You've got to broaden yourself and become conversant, if not deeply knowledgeable, about areas that are going to impinge on the one that you're primarily interested in. There's an old adage among legal scholars that it's actually a metaphor, that the law is a seamless web, that all of these areas really bleed into one another. And I think that is especially true of literacy. Various areas are mutually inform one another, and if you're ignorant of a major area, then it's going to reflect in your thinking, and it's going to influence how knowledgeable you actually are. So I think that maintaining a certain level of knowledgeability across the board will not only make you a clearer thinker, but will make you a better teacher as well. So in retrospect, I don't really have any regrets about being spread a bit thin. Sometimes I'm caught short if I don't. It's difficult to stay current in a number of different areas, but not impossible. And you can be caught short if you haven't read a particular article in a particular field. But I think that the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages of being of these narrow confines. You've got to broaden yourself, and not everybody can become a Steve Stahl or a Freddie Hebert who is knowledgeable in vast numbers of areas, but you can maintain a reasonable level of knowledgeability, and that's what is really going to inform your thinking about your area of primary interest. With respect to educational policy, that I've written about an age-old riddle, and this is the riddle. What would happen if an irresistible force met an immovable object? There's no answer, of course, because it's a semantic trick, because being irresistible and being immovable are opposites that can't possibly coexist. However, I think that idea is especially germane to the immovable object that we encounter in literacy, and that is the unacceptably large proportion of kids at the elementary, middle, and high school levels who are not attaining proficiency, who are operating well below even a basic level of literacy proficiency. So a number of so-called irresistible forces have been unleashed on this immovable object without much success at all through the past half century or more. We think of federal initiatives, such beginning with Title I, extending through things like the Reading Excellence Act and Reading First, Striving Readers. And if you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Reading, you find that there are, a few upticks, downticks, but largely no progress at all. It should be called the National Assessment of the Lack of Educational Progress. That's where we stand. And I'm not giving up on large-scale initiatives. My problem is that they tend not to learn from the past of what's worked, what hasn't worked, in part because they go back to the same designs over and over again, and they don't take a more fine-grained approach to what's working where and what we can learn from those lessons. So I'm hopeful that we can still make a difference, but it's probably going to be in pocketed areas rather than in sweeping changes that can be institutionalized. Literacy is simply too complicated, and context does matter. And the idea of finding some magic bullet that is going to work for everyone is probably unrealistic.